Good evening, traveler, and welcome once again to History Without Taboos. It is midnight here in England, and as always I prepare this story so that by the next midnight it may find you, wherever you are, whatever hour you hold. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you? Tonight, we step into shadows older than kings, older than empires, older even than the first books written on clay. We step into the story of drugs, their origins, their uses, their powers, both sacred and cursed. Imagine the first time a human plucked a seed, a root, a leaf from the earth and swallowed it. Hunger might have driven the act, but what followed was not nourishment, it was transformation. The world shimmered differently, pain softened, fear eased. And in that moment, the long, complicated history of drugs began. At its root was the poppy, the delicate flower with petals of fire and a heart filled with white sap. From this sap came opium, a bitter resin that could soothe agony, silence a cough, or plunge a man into dreams deeper than sleep. Archaeologists have found traces of opium in Neolithic settlements, proof that its secrets were known before writing was ever invented. By the time of ancient Sumer, the poppy had earned its first name, Hul-Gil, the joy plant. Tablets written in cuneiform, the earliest script of humankind, describe its use. It was medicine, but also more than medicine. It was comfort, mystery, and perhaps already temptation. The Egyptians followed. In their papyrus texts of medicine, they recommended opium for crying children, for pain in the stomach, for the restless who could not sleep. Picture it, a mother dipping bread in a mixture of honey and poppy sap, pressing it gently to the lips of a wailing infant, and watching silence return to the night. Mercy or risk, both at once. The Greeks inherited the plant, and from them came the myths of Morpheus, god of dreams, who carried a crown of poppies. They believed the flowers grew in the fields of Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Thanatos, the god of death. How fitting, one plant, binding together sleep and death, healing and ruin. Even their philosophers knew this paradox. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, warned against opium's dangers, even as he prescribed it. Galen, centuries later, wrote of its power to calm pain, but feared the shadows it left on the mind. And then Rome. Imagine the emperor Marcus Aurelius, philosopher on the throne, writing meditations in the quiet of night. History tells us he relied on opium to calm his pain, to soften the weight of rulership. Poppy mixed with wine, blended with honey. An emperor's relief, a mortal's crutch. It is strange to think that a man praised for his wisdom may have faced the same temptations, the same dependence as countless others after him. Yet opium was only one of many doors opened by the ancients. The earth was filled with plants whose juices could numb, excite, or reveal visions. Belladonna, the beautiful lady, with berries so deadly that a single handful could stop a heart. And yet, drops of its juice were once used by women to dilate their eyes, giving them an unnatural allure. Beauty and poison twinned in one plant. Hemlock, the bitter herb that killed Socrates. A philosopher's death, calm and deliberate, yet delivered by a poison taken from weeds along the road. Even mushrooms, some revered, some feared. In Siberia, shamans drank the fly agaric, red-capped and white-spotted, chasing visions that blurred the line between spirit and flesh. Drugs were medicine, drugs were ritual, drugs were poison. In the ancient world, there was no dividing line. And so we see the pattern that will echo for millennia. Substances both worshipped and feared, embraced and condemned. The ancients did not know chemical structures, nor the word addiction. But they knew relief, they knew vision, they knew the delicate edge between healing and ruin. This was the beginning, a flower in the hand, a drop of sap on the tongue, a dream too deep to escape. The history of drugs does not begin in laboratories or wars. It begins here, in the fields, in the temples, in the silence of the night. Imagine stepping into a temple, the air thick with incense, the smoke of burning herbs twisting upward like a bridge to the gods. For in the ancient world, what we call drugs were not vices. They were sacraments, gifts of the earth to guide mortals into visions, to heal wounds, to silence hunger, or to carry a soul closer to the divine. The poppy remained at the center of this mystery. In Egypt, its sap was mixed with honey and pressed to the lips of restless children, their cries softening into silence. In Greece, poppies crowned the temples of Hypnos and Thanatos, gods of sleep and death, for the ancients already understood that this flower held both mercy and peril in its delicate petals. But the poppy was not alone. Across the ancient world, countless plants opened strange doors. Belladonna, the beautiful lady whose poison widened pupils and gave women a haunted, shimmering allure, though at the risk of blindness or madness. Hemlock, bitter and deadly, chosen as the cup for Socrates, who drank it calmly as his pupils wept, his death as much a lesson as his life. And in the north, healers whispered of herbs that could make the body feel as though it soared through the air, leaving the weight of flesh behind. Even emperors turned to these plants. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher on the throne of Rome, wrote his meditations with a calmness many praised. Yet some say his serenity was laced with opium, wine mixed with poppy and honey, turning pain into gentleness, sorrow into forgiveness. If true, then even wisdom itself may sometimes have leaned upon the stem of a flower. The warrior, too, was not untouched. Soldiers were given opium to quiet wounds, to keep them alive long enough to march again. In other lands, fighters chewed leaves or drank potions before battle, believing that courage could be summoned in the blood, that fear could be erased by the gifts of plants. Perhaps it worked, or perhaps they only believed, and belief itself was enough to drive them into the fire. And always there were the visions. At Delphi, priestesses inhaled vapors rising from the earth, their minds unraveling into riddles that shaped the fate of kings. Were these the voices of gods, or the breath of the mountain itself, filled with gases that bent perception? The ancients could not have known. What mattered was that the visions came and that they carried power. To live in the ancient world was to live without the borders we now draw between medicine and poison, between healing and hallucination. The same plant could save a life or take it. The same sip could be mercy or curse. Drugs were not forbidden. They were mysteries, woven into the fabric of ritual, survival and death. And so humanity walked always on a thin edge, balancing between the sacred and the profane, never certain whether the next taste of resin or leaf would carry them toward the divine or plunge them into silence forever. The story shifts now, traveler, from temples and philosophers to ships and cannons. For centuries, opium had been medicine, ritual, a quiet shadow in the lives of men and women. But in the 19th century, it changed. It became profit, it became empire, and with that, it became war. Picture the great empire of China. For millennia, it had stood proud, wealthy, self-sufficient. The emperor ruled beneath the mandate of heaven, his court cloaked in ritual, his people bound by tradition. Silk, porcelain, and tea flowed outward from China to the rest of the world, treasures so desired in Europe that ships crossed oceans to bring them home. But the West had a problem. The Chinese did not want their goods. European silver poured eastward in rivers, and little returned. Trade was unbalanced, and in the counting houses of London, men whispered of ruin. And then came the answer: opium. The British East India Company grew vast fields of poppies in India, their milky sap harvested and pressed into bricks of resin. Opium flowed in endless caravans toward Chinese ports. At first, the drug trickled into the empire's veins quietly, a luxury for the few. But soon the trickle became a flood. By the early 19th century, millions in China were addicted. Laborers smoked it in pipes after long days of toil. Scholars sought it for dreams. Soldiers, merchants, peasants. The flower that once crowned temples now hollowed out an empire. The emperor saw the danger. Edicts were proclaimed. Opium was banned. Officials raided warehouses, burned chests of the drug in great pyres. In Canton, Commissioner Lin Zexu seized thousands of crates from British merchants and destroyed them. He wrote to Queen Victoria herself, begging her to forbid the trade. But the Queen did not reply. And so the war began. British ships, sleek and iron-tipped, fired upon Chinese junks and coastal forts. Cannons thundered, harbours burned. The empire that had resisted foreign influence for centuries was suddenly exposed, its defences weak before modern guns. The First Opium War ended with humiliation, the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. China was forced to open its ports, pay vast reparations, and surrender Hong Kong to the British Crown. It was more than defeat. It was the breaking of pride. An empire once closed and unyielding was carved open by the very drug it had tried to ban. And yet the hunger for profit did not end there. When resistance rose again, another war followed. The Second Opium War, fought in the 1850s, brought even greater losses. Foreign powers marched into Beijing, looted the Summer Palace, and forced yet more treaties upon the weakened empire. The wars were not fought for freedom or faith. They were fought for trade, specifically for the right to poison. For the right of foreign merchants to pump opium into China's markets, even against the will of its rulers. The irony is bitter. A plant once sacred, a medicine once soothing, had become a weapon. The British justified it as commerce, as necessity. But to China it was devastation. Millions addicted, wealth drained, sovereignty shattered. The century of humiliation had begun, and at its heart was the soft white sap of the poppy. And so, as we look back, we must ask, what is more dangerous, the drug itself, or the greed of those who trade it? For the wars of opium remind us that addiction is not only personal. Entire empires can be broken by it. Traveler, the world changes now. We leave behind the smoke-filled dens of Canton and the thunder of British cannons and step into a new century of invention, industry, and science. The 19th century was an age of progress, or so it claimed. Railways cut across continents, telegraphs carried voices through wires, and medicine advanced at a pace unseen before. And in the laboratories of Europe, men began to look at ancient plants with new eyes. They asked not only what comfort they gave, but what secrets lay hidden in their sap, their leaves, their seeds. The age of chemistry had begun. In 1804, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner achieved something no one had before. From raw opium, he extracted a single alkaloid, a pure crystal. He named it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. For here in his hands was not a sticky resin or a bitter syrup, but the essence itself, the distilled spirit of the poppy. Morphine was hailed as a miracle. Doctors embraced it with enthusiasm, prescribing it for pain, for coughs, for sleeplessness. Soldiers carried it into battlefields where it eased the agony of shattered limbs. After the American Civil War, morphine was so widely used that thousands of veterans returned home not only scarred by war, but bound to a new dependence. The world called it the soldier's disease. Relief had come, but at a terrible price. Not long after, another discovery shook the medical world. In 1860, the German chemist Albert Niemann isolated a compound from the leaves of the coca plant. Indigenous peoples of South America had chewed coca leaves for centuries, finding in them stamina, hunger's silence, and the strength to endure long journeys through mountains. Niemann named the substance cocaine. Europe was enthralled. This white powder was sharper, more energetic than morphine's dream. Doctors praised it as a stimulant, a cure for exhaustion, a treatment for depression. Even the famous neurologist Sigmund Freud championed it. writing essays about its powers, urging its use for addiction and melancholy alike. "You are cured," he told one patient, offering cocaine as salvation. Yet in time, the cure became its own illness. Cocaine slipped beyond the clinic into the bloodstream of culture. In the stories of Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle's detective injects himself with a 7% solution of cocaine. His brilliant mind sharpened, his long nights quickened by the drug. And in the everyday lives of Europeans and Americans, cocaine was sold not only as medicine, but as refreshment. It appeared in tonics, in wines, even in the first recipes of Coca-Cola, a bubbling drink that carried with it a whisper of the Andes. Imagine it, a society sipping casually from bottles of what today would be considered contraband, praising it as tonic, tonic as cure, cure as comfort. No stigma, no shame, only progress. But behind the enthusiasm, shadows lengthened. Morphine, once a blessing, created new waves of dependence. Cocaine, praised by Freud, began to hollow out lives. Science had unlocked the secrets of plants, but it had also unleashed powers that societies were unprepared to contain. The 19th century was intoxicated by its own discoveries. The scalpel of chemistry cut deep, extracting essence from nature, distilling comfort into crystals, powders, injections. Yet every cure carried its ghost. Morphine, cocaine, gifts and curses, like the poppy and the coca themselves, only stronger now, more pure, more irresistible. The ancients had tasted plants as they grew in fields and forests, but in the 19th century, humanity began to refine them, to crystallize their power, to magnify their effects. What was once ritual became chemical. What was once natural became industrial. And so the story of drugs entered a new age, the laboratory age, when miracles were bottled, injected, swallowed, and when the line between medicine and poison blurred more than ever before. Traveler, let us linger now in the heart of the 19th century, where science and culture walk hand in hand, and where drugs are no longer confined to apothecaries' jars, but spill into every corner of society. This was the age of progress, the age of invention, the age that believed no boundary could stop human ingenuity. But beneath the bright banners of discovery lay a truth more complicated. Medicine and culture alike were becoming intoxicated. In the clinics of Europe, doctors reached eagerly for new remedies. Morphine was injected with polished brass syringes, its crystalline purity seen as safer, more modern than raw opium. Cocaine was prescribed for exhaustion, toothache, even as an anesthetic for delicate surgeries. For the first time, patients could undergo operations without the agony that once defined them. Surgeons praised cocaine as a miracle that steadied their hands and stilled their patients' cries. But the story did not end in the hospital. Drugs seeped outward, into daily life, into literature, into the imagination of entire generations. Consider Sigmund Freud, whose fascination with cocaine shaped both medicine and myth. He praised it not only for its stimulant qualities, but as a treatment for addiction itself, prescribing it to patients who struggled with morphine dependence. For a time, Freud even used it on himself, convinced it sharpened his mind and lifted his spirit. In his letters, he wrote of the joy it brought, the energy, the confidence. Yet in the lives of his patients, the supposed cure often deepened the wound, binding them to yet another chain. Or consider Arthur Conan Doyle, a physician himself, who gave his most famous creation, Sherlock Holmes, a needle and a habit. Holmes, brilliant but restless, injects himself with cocaine to pass the long hours between cases. It was a detail drawn from Doyle's own medical world, where the drug was common and unremarkable, but it gave Holmes a dark edge, a genius illuminated by a dangerous flame. And then, there was the world of commerce. Cocaine slipped into tonics, wines, elixirs. A glass of Vin Mariani, a French wine laced with coca, was said to inspire poets and soothe nerves. Even popes sipped it, praising its invigorating effect. Across the Atlantic in the United States, a young pharmacist experimented with coca leaves and cola nuts, creating a drink that fizzed with bubbles and promised refreshment. Coca-Cola, as it came to be known, carried cocaine in its earliest recipes, selling visions of energy in every glass. Culture absorbed these substances not as poisons, but as progress. Writers, artists, philosophers, and ordinary citizens alike praised them as gifts of modernity, proof that science could conquer pain, lift depression, fuel inspiration. Drugs became not only medicine, but muse. The dream of opium, the sharp spark of cocaine, the soft embrace of morphine, all were celebrated as tools of the modern age. And yet, behind the applause, shadows grew. Dependence spread quietly. Families discovered that morphine, prescribed for sleeplessness, became a master rather than a servant. Cocaine, once praised by Freud, was linked to paranoia, collapse, and ruin. The very substances that promised freedom bound countless lives to new forms of captivity. The 19th century did not yet speak of drug epidemics in the way we do now, but the seeds were already sown. In the glow of gaslight, in the pages of novels, in the wards of hospitals, drugs had become not only treatments, but symbols of progress, of culture, of power. And as symbols, they held sway over imagination even more strongly than over the body. This was the paradox. A society that prided itself on reason, invention, and control, embracing substances that dissolved control itself. Medicine and culture danced together in a haze of powders and syrups, never suspecting that the very tools they praised might soon rise as specters against them. Traveler, the century turns. Gaslight gives way to electric bulbs, carriages to automobiles, and telegrams to telephones. The pace of life quickens, and with it, a hunger rises. A hunger for energy, for endurance, for something sharper and stronger than the comforts of morphine or the dreams of opium. The world wants speed, and so the world invents it. In 1887, a Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleanu first synthesized a new compound, amphetamine. At the time, it was little more than a curiosity, a chemical noted and shelved. But by the 1920s, its potential began to gleam in the eyes of doctors and businessmen alike. Amphetamines lifted fatigue, sharpened focus, and banished appetite. Students could study longer, workers could labor without pause, pilots could fly through the night. By the 1930s, amphetamines had entered pharmacies under brand names like Benzedrine. They were sold as inhalers for congestion, but their effects went far beyond a clear nose. The world called them pep pills, little capsules of energy in a restless age. And then came war. The Second World War was not fought only with tanks and rifles, but with chemicals that coursed through the veins of millions of soldiers. In Germany, the drug Pervitin, a form of methamphetamine, was distributed to troops in staggering quantities. Soldiers swallowed tablets before long marches, before sleepless nights, before the brutal push across Europe. Reports tell of men who marched for days without rest, their bodies sustained not by food or sleep, but by the burning fire of stimulants. Some historians whisper that even Hitler himself leaned on methamphetamine injections, his speeches and rages fueled by chemicals hidden beneath the surface of power. The Allies, too, embraced stimulants. Amphetamines were given to British and American pilots, keeping them awake through endless bombing raids. The war became not only a battle of armies, but of altered minds, each side searching for the chemical edge that could tip fate in their favor. But when the guns fell silent, the pills did not vanish. Soldiers returned home with habits formed on the battlefield. Doctors continued to prescribe amphetamines for depression, for obesity, for lethargy. Housewives used them to quiet exhaustion, students to fuel their studies, workers to endure long hours in factories. By the 1950s, America alone was consuming hundreds of millions of pills each year. The promise was intoxicating: clarity, energy, control. Yet beneath it lay paranoia, sleeplessness, and dependence. What began as medicine became mania. What began as a tool of war seeped into every corner of civilian life. Amphetamines reflected the age that birthed them. This was the century of speed. Faster machines, faster communication, faster lives. People believed they could outpace exhaustion, outpace nature itself, with chemistry as their ally. For a time it seemed to work, but always the body demanded payment. Always the shadow followed the light. And so, in the early 20th century, humanity discovered a new face of intoxication. Not the dream of opium, not the euphoria of cocaine, but the hard, bright edge of endless wakefulness. It was the chemistry of speed, and it would shape not only the lives of individuals, but the destiny of nations. In 1938, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann was studying ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. Ergot had long been feared in Europe, for in the Middle Ages it brought with it St. Anthony's fire, hallucinations, convulsions, madness, and death for those who ate contaminated bread. Hofmann was searching for useful compounds hidden within this dangerous mold, medicines that might help the heart and lungs. He synthesized a substance he called lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD-25. At first, it seemed unremarkable, and the vial was set aside. But years later, in 1943, Hofmann returned to it. During his work, a trace of the substance entered his bloodstream. Suddenly the world shifted. Colors deepened, sounds vibrated with strange intensity, and his thoughts dissolved into visions. Curious, he took a measured dose days later and set out on his bicycle. The ride that followed became legend. Bicycle Day, the first deliberate LSD trip, a journey into a kaleidoscope of reality. At first, LSD lived in laboratories. Psychiatrists tested it as a tool to explore the mind, to treat depression, to unlock hidden memories. For a brief moment, it was hailed as a miracle of psychology, a chemical key to consciousness itself. But the 1960s were waiting. In a world of protest, music, and rebellion, LSD leapt from the clinic into the streets. It became the emblem of the counterculture, the psychedelic revolution. Young people sought it not to cure, but to expand, not to numb, but to awaken. They dropped acid at concerts, in communes, in quiet rooms where music and light became gateways to the infinite. The voices of the era celebrated it. Writers, musicians, philosophers spoke of LSD as liberation, a dissolving of the prison walls of ordinary thought. Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychologist turned prophet of the psychedelic age, urged his followers to turn on, tune in, drop out. Music echoed with the visions of acid trips, the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, sounds shaped by colors no one else could see. Yet just as in every chapter of this story, shadow followed light. For every vision of beauty, there were nights of terror, paranoia, panic, the sense of never returning from the spiral. Governments grew fearful. In the United States, LSD was linked to unrest, to rebellion, to the fear that young minds were dissolving beyond control. By the late 1960s, it was banned, condemned as a dangerous hallucinogen, a threat to order. And yet its echoes remained. Artists continued to whisper of it. Researchers in secret studied its effects, and the dream of expanded consciousness never fully died. Even now, in laboratories once again, scientists are exploring psychedelics for their potential to heal depression, trauma, addiction. Questions that linger from Hofmann's first ride through the Swiss countryside. LSD was unlike the drugs that came before. It was not about dulling pain or fueling endurance or sharpening clarity. It was about breaking open the self, seeing not the world as it is, but as it might be, in all its strangeness and terror. It carried with it both promise and peril, liberation and madness. The psychedelic revolution revealed one truth, that humanity's hunger is not only to escape suffering, but to transcend reality itself. And in that hunger, the story of drugs took another turn, into visions both wondrous and forbidden. The story begins with prohibition, not of drugs, but of alcohol. In 1920, the United States ratified the 18th Amendment, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of liquor. The dream was of purity, sobriety, and moral reform. The reality was blood and profit. Speakeasies bloomed in hidden basements, bootleggers sped across dark roads, and crime syndicates grew rich on forbidden drink. Al Capone became a household name, his empire of liquor making him as powerful as a king. When Prohibition collapsed in 1933, its lesson was clear. Banning desire does not erase it. It only drives it underground, where shadows grow thicker and profits fatter. The same logic soon applied to drugs. By mid-century, governments began to outlaw substances once sold in pharmacies. Cocaine, morphine, cannabis, LSD, all were swept into the category of forbidden. What had once been medicine or ritual was redefined as crime. And then came Richard Nixon. In 1971, the American president declared drug abuse public enemy number one. Thus began the war on drugs. It was more than policy. It was rhetoric, a framing of addiction not as illness but as threat, not as human suffering, but as a battle against an enemy within. Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, to fight this war. Billions were poured into policing, prisons filled, and communities, especially poor and marginalized, were torn apart. The line between user and criminal blurred, and with it the promise of justice twisted. But drugs do not vanish with decrees. Instead, they adapt. As America cracked down, Latin America became both supplier and battlefield. Vast cartels rose in Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Bolivia. Governments waged bloody wars against traffickers, but profits from cocaine and heroin dwarfed national budgets. For many, the drug trade was not crime. It was survival, economy, power. The United States spent billions to fight supply abroad, sending weapons, funding military campaigns, building alliances. Yet cocaine flowed north, heroin too, and later methamphetamines and synthetic drugs. Miami became a capital of smuggling. Jungle airstrips buzzed with secret flights. The war was global now. And in all of this, a question lingered. Was the war on drugs truly about health, or was it about control? Some argued it was a means to expand police power, to target communities of color, to wage not only against substances, but against people. Others believed it was a necessary defense against chaos, a wall to hold back a flood. Whatever the truth, one fact is undeniable. Prohibition did not end drugs. It made them more profitable. It shifted them from pharmacies to street corners, from doctors' hands to cartels' guns. The war on drugs revealed the old paradox once again. Humanity has always reached for relief, for courage, for vision. And rulers have always sought to dictate the terms of that reaching. But desire cannot be outlawed. It can only be hidden, punished, or exploited. The 20th century turned drugs into a stage for politics, a banner for wars both foreign and domestic. And in that war, the cost was not only counted in money, but in lives. Millions imprisoned, millions dead, millions more lost in the shadows. Picture Colombia in the 1970s. From the fertile fields of the Andes came coca leaves harvested by poor farmers, their value multiplied 1,000-fold, once refined into cocaine. Airplanes lifted from secret strips cut into the jungle. Boats slipped across oceans, and at the heart of it all rose a name that would echo through history. Pablo Escobar. Escobar, the king of cocaine, built a fortune so vast it rivaled the GDP of nations. At his height, The Medellin cartel supplied 80% of the world's cocaine, earning tens of billions each year. He owned fleets of planes, submarines, mansions, even a private zoo. He funded schools and housing for the poor, buying loyalty with generosity and terror alike. For many Colombians, he was both benefactor and butcher, Robin Hood and tyrant. Across the ocean in the United States, cocaine flooded Miami. The city became the beating heart of the trade, its nightlife glittering with money, its streets echoing with gunfire. The cocaine cowboys transformed neighborhoods into battlegrounds, their wealth measured in yachts and Ferraris, their wars fought with automatic weapons. Miami in the 1980s was both paradise and war zone, its skyline built on smuggled powder. Governments fought back, but the cartels were hydras. Cut off one head, another rose. The Cali cartel replaced Medellin. Then Mexico's cartels, with roots across the US border, grew into titans of their own. Sinaloa, Juarez, Los Zetas, organizations with armies, with spies, with budgets larger than the police sent to fight them. What makes these empires so enduring is profit. Drugs became, by some estimates, the most profitable business in the world. A kilogram of cocaine could be bought in the jungle for a few $1,000s and sold in New York or London for tens of thousands. The margins were obscene, the incentives unstoppable. For poor farmers, it was the only livelihood. For smugglers, the only chance at wealth. For lords like Escobar, it was power enough to challenge entire nations. And nations did respond. American agents hunted Escobar through the streets of Medellin until, in 1993, he was killed on a rooftop. But even in death he became legend, his story told in whispers, in songs, in television dramas. The man was gone, but the trade endured. The modern drug trade is not only Colombia, not only Mexico, it is Afghanistan, where opium fields fund militias. It is the golden triangle of Southeast Asia, where heroin once flowed in rivers. It is cartels of every continent, adapting, shifting, creating networks that span the globe. Today, the narcotics trade is estimated at hundreds of billions each year, shaping politics, economies, even the budgets of entire nations. And behind it all lies the same truth as in every chapter of this story. Plants, powders and chemicals that humanity cannot let go. From the sap of the poppy to the powder of cocaine, desire endures. And where desire endures, power follows. The age of the drug lords revealed the ultimate consequence of prohibition and profit. It turned narcotics into nations within nations, empires of shadow that rivaled the daylight powers of presidents and generals. And so we arrive at the present, a world where the line between state and cartel, between politics and profit, between law and crime, blurs more with each passing year. Traveler, we have walked a long road together, from the first poppies pressed into the hands of crying children, to emperors drinking opium mixed with honey, to British merchants waging wars for profit, to chemists bottling powders of pain and energy, to the jungles of Colombia and the neon streets of Miami. Drugs have never been only substances. They have always been power, power over the body. The soldier who swallows a pill before battle, marching for days without sleep. The patient who accepts morphine, sighing as agony dissolves into silence. The dreamer who takes LSD and sees the world reborn in colors never painted before. In every age, substances promised mastery over human frailty, to numb pain, to grant strength, to awaken visions, to touch something beyond the ordinary. But power over the body is fleeting. Relief fades, energy collapses, visions dissolve, and so the user takes again and again until power becomes prison, power over societies. The rulers of China tried to ban opium, and their empire was humbled by cannon fire. The United States tried to outlaw alcohol, and instead birthed syndicates of crime. Later, it declared war on drugs, filling prisons but never emptying the streets. Prohibition and profit dance together, each step making the other stronger. The more forbidden, the more valuable. The more valuable, the more impossible to forbid. Drugs have shaped laws, built empires, toppled governments. They have been tools of control, whether to pacify a population, to fuel soldiers, or to justify crackdowns. And they have been tools of rebellion, symbols of counterculture, of freedom, of rejecting the order imposed from above. Power over history itself, think of it. An empire's humiliation, an emperor's calm, a philosopher's death, a cartel's fortune, a president's war. Behind each moment, a flower, a leaf, a vial. History has been written not only in ink and blood, but in powders and syrups, in dreams and addictions. The story of drugs is the story of humanity's hunger. Hunger for relief, for transcendence, for escape, for control. A hunger so deep it cannot be silenced by laws or wars. A hunger that is in truth part of what it means to be human. So I ask you now, as this journey closes, could you have survived it? Could you have lived in a world where mothers gave poppy syrup to infants, where philosophers drank poison with calm acceptance, where kings and generals leaned on powders to carry empires forward? Could you survive in our world today, where desire fuels cartels, where laws blur justice, where entire nations are balanced on the weight of forbidden plants? Perhaps survival was never the question. Perhaps the question is what we lose and what we become when we try to master our fears and our pain with the chemistry of the earth. And so, dear listener, the story closes. The candles are dimmed, the fields of poppies fade into darkness, the echo of drums and visions drifts away. The history of drugs is not finished. It is still being written in the alleys of cities, in the quiet of hospitals, in the minds of those who seek escape. But tonight, our part of the tale is told. Thank you for walking this long path with me. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it for you? And tell me too, after hearing this story, what do you think? Are drugs curses, blessings, or simply mirrors showing us our own hunger? Rest well, traveler. Another midnight will bring another story, another shadow, another secret. Until then, dream deeply and may your mind be free.